Hello and welcome to the programme which looks at the Holy Land. I am Paul Calvert. Psalm 43 verse 1 from the New King James Bible says this: "Vindicate me, O God, and plead my cause against an unjust nation."
I'm with Adam Lerwick from CAMRA, Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting. Now, Adam, we're seeing difficulties in Gaza at the moment, but how is the media when it comes to reporting Gaza?
Unfortunately, most of the media outlets, and certainly the outlets that I cover, which are in the UK, are promoting unsubstantiated claims by the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, which every now and then put out different supposed statistics on the number of its citizens and children that have died from what they say are hunger-related reasons. There's literally no way to verify that. Of course, this is Hamas, a terrorist group prescribed in the UK in full, who launched the worst anti-Semitic massacre since the Holocaust on October 7, 2023. And the fact that media outlets are so quick to believe these statements by Hamas, I think, shows that an ethical abdication by media outlets whose job it is to verify facts and to verify information. So, in the nearly 2 years since the war began, this is, I think, consistent with a pattern of a failure of journalists to do due diligence. But I think it's one of the most egregious examples because, we're seeing anti-Semitic events, a tsunami of anti-Semitism occurring throughout the West, in Western capitals, in part driven by this sensational incendiary claim that Israel is starving Gaza. Now, I'm not arguing in any sense that there isn't food insecurity in Gaza. There's a lot about what's going on the ground we don't know that nobody knows. And certainly, if even one child is suffering as the result of this food insecurity, then that's one too many. And we, as someone who, promotes Israel's cause, that doesn't mean that we're indifferent to Palestinian suffering. But the media has been promoting the Palestinian agenda, and I would argue effectively promoting the Hamas agenda, not outwardly promoting Hamas's policy, but by not fact-checking Hamas claims, they're effectively advocating, on behalf of their cause. And it's been an extremely challenging situation for us at CAMRA because, it is hard to really fact-check when the claims are just anecdotal statistics put out by the ministries. So it's been a very difficult time, and I think the media really has a lot to answer for in its coverage of what they claim is starvation in Gaza.
Hamas are the governing authority. They're a terrorist organization. So does all the Gaza information come from them? So if the United Nations quote a figure, well, they've got that figure from Hamas.
Exactly. The UN has no independent mechanism for verifying information in Gaza. They go by the Gaza Health Ministry, the Gaza Media Office. There isn't an independent civil society in Gaza. There wasn't before October 7th. There wasn't after October 7th. And so, international agencies such as the UN are essentially going by almost entirely, maybe with few exceptions, entirely by what's reported by the Hamas from ministries themselves. So instead of doing the honest thing, and that is, saying that they don't know, they report it as if it's a fact, as if, somehow Israel is being, cynical by not believing what's coming out of Hamas ministries. So, it's a very, very ethically compromised situation when it comes to media outlets quoting the UN relying not on its own data, but on the data of, like you said, Hamas ministries. It's a cycle of misinformation and sometimes disinformation that misleads the news consumers that they're trying to inform.
And of course, as a religion, Hamas are allowed to lie to the West to let them know, that things aren't actually what they say. And they actually revised their numbers, didn't they, just recently when we were being told that so many people were being killed and they said 70% of it was actually some of their fighters.
Okay, so yeah, there's been a series of kind of retractions and revisions. The latest numbers that came out of Gaza that were crunched by reliable sources shows that, I think, whereas for a long time the Gaza Health Ministry was saying that 70% of those killed in Gaza were women and children, now that number is something like 46%. And that the largest overall percentage of those killed have been fighting-age males. So while it's still impossible to know for sure what the exact ratio is of combatants to non-combatants, even by Hamas's own figures, it's no longer the case, even, by their figures, that the overwhelming majority of those killed are women and children. Like, they've essentially retracted that for the time being. And so, in fact, we recently complained to the New Statesman, which is a magazine, as you know, based in the UK. They had a contributor who still claimed that 70% of those killed are women and children, and not even Gaza Health Ministry / Hamas, not even the UN is making that claim. So, yeah, we've been trying to push back against these old figures, which we sense were untrue at the time, but now, it's unquestionable that they were untrue.
Now, we've seen a couple of pictures of little boys. The media says they're starving. Is that the full story?
Now, in many cases, as Camera UK and as David Collier, who I'm sure you know, have revealed, a lot of these children have had comorbidities, meaning that in one case, Camera UK, my colleague Kadar, has revealed that a boy named Osama al-Rakab, who was portrayed as a starving child based on the lack of food, in fact, he had a condition. It wasn't cerebral palsy, it was cystic fibrosis. All right, and not only did he have cystic fibrosis, he, since that photo of an emaciated boy, this poor boy named Osama, was taken, he was transferred by Israeli authorities to a hospital outside of the country, and his condition has improved dramatically. So here's a situation in which the young boy was suffering. He had cystic fibrosis, which made his digestive system compromised, and he was being presented in BBC articles as a victim of Israel's quote-unquote starvation campaign. And we proved that that's not the case, and that, in fact, there's this great before and after photo. I would recommend you and your listeners to go to Camera UK and look at it to see this tragic photo of a boy, Osama, before and after. And after, he looks like, he's still thin, but he looks like more of a healthy boy. Thankfully, he's gotten the medical treatment he's needed. There's another situation that was revealed by David Collier, a boy named Mohammed, who also was presented by various media outlets as the face of Israeli quote-unquote starvation in Gaza, or Israeli-made starvation in Gaza, and it turned out that he had cerebral palsy. And of course, cerebral palsy is a condition, and I'm not a doctor, but it's a condition that, it's clear, makes it hard for children to gain weight. It compromises their digestive system. So very often what we're seeing in the media and it's very hard to prove sometimes, but we have proved that some of these children that you see, and they're heart-wrenching photos, and anybody who is a parent knows that the last thing you want to do is see a photo or see a child that's suffering. But very often there are comorbidities which the media outlets have not revealed. And so, we've been trying really hard to get this information out there.
It seems to be quite dishonest. So it makes you question, if they have to make up someone who's got a problem with their health, they mustn't be able to find people who are starving, because if there was people who are starving, surely you'd have enough photographs to promote them rather than someone who has a problem. So it's a little bit dishonest, isn't it?
It's extremely dishonest, but it's also just a failure of, it may sound intuitive, Paul, but, what reporters need to do is do reporting. To do real investigative journalism requires digging. And they often claim that since international journalists, most of whom anyway, aren't allowed into Gaza, that they can't do the kind of on-the-ground research that they need to. But, the research that David Collier and my colleague Hadar did was just based on, publicly available open source information we found online. So what we're finding, and again, we're very careful not to accuse journalists of intentionally lying unless we have evidence of that effect, but they're certainly failing to do their job, to abide by the broadest understanding of what it means to be a professional journalist by digging and not publishing a photo of a child, presenting him as starving due to lack of food when there's some other reason causing his gaunt skeletal appearance. It's a very basic job. Do journalism, do the work that your profession is supposed to do. And very often we find due to laziness and due to the fact that they want clicks and due to the fact that they have a particular agenda that they want to promote, they don't do due diligence.
Now, I've seen Elon Levy. He's been into Gaza and he showed pallets of food that are just sitting there in Gaza. So it's not a question of food getting into Gaza. It's already in Gaza and it's not being delivered. So again, is the media blaming the wrong person for this?
Yeah, again, as I said, I think earlier, it's complicated. Certainly that's part of the story, and the media does not want to tell that side of the story. They also have decided from the beginning of late May, when the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation launched its operations to supply food, an American Israeli-U.S. organization set up to bypass Hamas so that Hamas can't steal the aid and use it for their own war purposes. The media made the decision that they were going to discredit this organization, and they routinely describe the organization as controversial. They take claims that Israelis have fired on innocent Gazans queuing up for food at face value. So again, whether it's involving the trucks that have not been picked up in Gaza, whether it's involving the new aid distribution system run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, we're seeing agenda-driven journalism that helps Hamas, that gives Hamas the confidence to turn down ceasefire offers because they know that the public opinion is turning against Israel. We're finding journalists that may not be intending to do this, but the reporting essentially is, wind behind Hamas's sail. And so it's not just bad journalism. It has a bad impact for Israel and for Gaza civilians.
And we see the impact. We don't know for sure if there is a famine in Gaza, but false images sway opinion. And of course, last night, the UK Prime Minister is pressuring Israel and threatening to declare a Palestinian state. As a Jew, what did you think about that, what he said last night?
There's a lot of ways to answer that question. I will say, just to reinforce briefly what I said before, that it's the exactly opposite incentive that they want to send, because what Starmer actually said was that they won't declare, they won't accept statehood, they won't recognize Palestinian state if Israel meets certain conditions, those conditions being that it immediately declares a unilateral ceasefire and takes steps that the UK says it should take. So essentially what it's incentivizing is that, incentivizing Hamas to say no to the current ceasefire offers. Like, it's incentivizing Hamas to continue to be stubborn, to continue to refuse to surrender, to continue to refuse to release the hostages, because if all the onus is on Israel and what it does or what it doesn't do, then what pressure is on Hamas, right? It's sending the exact wrong incentives to Hamas. It's sending, it's putting all the onus on Israel and, kind of like, doing the opposite of what it intends to do. It's basically virtue signaling, but it's worse than virtue signaling. It's also preventing anything as resembling peace. Now, you asked me as a Jew, and of course, I work for Camera UK, so, my opinions are my opinions, but I find it just horrifying and repulsive that the terrorist organization, the anti-Semitic terror organization, is essentially being rewarded for having carried out the worst anti-Semitic massacre since the Holocaust. The last thing that the region needs is to empower Hamas, which is the party most responsible for the conflict, the war that has gone on for the past 2 years. The message from the international community, the message from the West needs to be that Hamas is the problem, and that, there can never be peace in the Middle East as long as Hamas continues to control Gaza. That needs to be the clear moral statement by the West. And so in my mind, Starmer is just failing to understand and failing to morally clarify what should be a very clear moral situation.
It seems a bit crazy and sort of means nothing on the ground. You've got Mahmoud Abbas, who's looking after the Palestinian Authority. You've got Hamas that's looking after Gaza. How do you actually bring these two together? And if you did get a Palestinian state and create a Palestinian state, it makes it less secure for Israel. But at the same time, the Hamas charter says, we don't just want a Palestinian state, we want everything, and they want to commit genocide again and again. So it is rewarding terror, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I just want to make clear for our listeners that Camera is a charity, a nonprofit organization. We don't take a position on what Israeli policy should be vis-a-vis two states, but I can state broadly that what you just said is accurate. That, the biggest impediment to peace is not anything Israel does or doesn't do. The biggest impediment to peace, whether it's two states or some other solution, is Hamas's genocidal ideology. Genocidal ideology that's on par with the Nazis. Now, they're not as, thank God, powerful as the Nazi Germany. They don't have the same industrial capacity. They don't have the same economic capacity. They don't have the same, international and political leverage. But, as Hamas officials said in the days after October 7th, if they have the capacity to do so, they would commit on October 7th style atrocity again, and again. So why this intuitive understanding of the biggest impediment to peace in the Middle East isn't understood by elites in politics, elites in journalism, elites in opinion leaders is beyond me. So the question of two states is something that I'm not going to take a position on. We don't take a position on, but clearly just the more important issue is who's responsible for the lack of peace and who needs to change their behavior to achieve peace should be so clear, and it's being obfuscated by media outlets that we cover.
Are you shocked at the way the media are reporting this war?
Yeah, in fact, I wrote a post at Camera UK in October of 2023, maybe a week and a half after the massacre. And, it was a very difficult post to write because it was written out of anguish. And, it was a couple weeks after the war began, and media outlets like The Guardian were already, believe it or not, promoting the ethnic cleansing / genocide charge. And this was even before Israel launched its ground invasion. And I said in this post, and, I could share it with you later if you want to share it with your listeners, that even I, as cynical as I had become, monitoring the media for over 13 years now, I wouldn't have predicted before October 7th that if something so barbaric, something so unimaginably cruel had happened to Jews in southern Israel, I wouldn't have predicted that the reaction of the media would have been to double down on their hatred of Israel. I would have assumed, if you would have asked me October 6th, that no, I would have thought that the media would have finally come to the realization that their reporting and the premises up until that point were wrong. That I assumed that there would have been some, cognitive dissonance that would lead them to apologize for their reporting up until then. But instead of apologizing, instead of having an aha moment, they doubled down on their ideology. Ideologies, someone once wrote, people hold onto them with a death grip. And instead of responding to the facts on the ground, the barbaric and monstrous treatment of 1,200 innocent men, women, and children in southern Israel, they doubled down. And they're not just The Guardian, but other media outlets also have just, gone out of their way to do what they can to kind of save face, right? To maintain the narrative that they've been advancing for decades. And I think that's the ultimate failure, is that they refuse to see the facts and change their opinions accordingly. I think one of the most profound judges of character are when people can, based on new evidence, change their mind. I know I've changed my mind on various issues based on new evidence, and they failed that basic test, and I think they should be ashamed of themselves, a lot of them. Not all of them. Some of them have done a good job, but a lot of them.
What is your prayer for Israel at this time as they face this media war?
I pray for peace. I pray that the hostages are returned speedily. I pray for an end of the war, and just that we can know peace. As an Israeli, I'm Aliyah. 16 years ago, not wanting to have war, not wanting to have to worry about friends and neighbors being called up 3-4 times for national reserve duty. I want an Israel that can live up to its potential, that can focus on the things that that we want to do. We want to, continue to be the high-tech nation, right? We want to continue to be a model for other countries in the Middle East for how you can have a progressive democracy. Want us to expand the Abraham Accords. I want peace, but in the immediate future, I want the 50 remaining hostages, unfortunately half of whom are only alive, to be released, and for the suffering on both sides to end.
You're finding problems in the media. What is your website for people who'd like to know more about what the media are saying and what are you finding out?
Yeah, camera.org. It's www.camera.org. And from the main Camera website, they can go to the Camera UK website. Like all of our brands, as you know, Paul, we monitor the media in English, Spanish, Hebrew, and Arabic. So all of our websites, all of those 4 websites, as well as our campus website, which is a little different, can be found at camera.org. It's really simple. And please note that we're very active on social media, on X/Twitter, on Instagram, and on Facebook. And I think we recently launched a TikTok channel. So we're very active on social media. But the home address is camera.org. And I really would recommend those who are interested in Israel and interested on how the media distorts the reporting about Israel to go onto our website, read our articles, which are well-sourced, which are well-researched, and which are factually accurate.
Well, Adam, thank you very much for sharing today.
My pleasure, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. Pray that God will move by his mighty power in the Holy Land and bring his peace.